Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have Tidbits. I'll answer a question from a viewer about how I feel about projects that are a bit of a slog. And I'll give you a close look at the progress in my 1970s vintage sweater project. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, tap or mouse over the video playback area of your screen and use the chapter titles to guide you to the starting point of the desired section. Use the gear icon to slow down or speed up playback. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me from Mim Landsister on Ravelry, who alerted me that this week is Nordic Craft Week. This year, the theme is sweaters. Nordic Craft Week ends on September 3rd, but there is a Facebook group for this annual event, which I will link down in the show notes. And in some cases, you can view videos from this year's events and even some from past years. So yesterday, there was a webinar for Nordic Craft Week on recreating a 160-year-old sweater. So this sweater is one that is traditional to the, I'm going to slaughter this, Hailuoto Island, I'm guessing is how you pronounce it. I'll put it on the screen. Mim Landsister provided a link to a blog post about these traditional sweaters. So there had been a sweater of this traditional type that had been passed down in a family for 160 years. So the people who are recreating it borrowed the sweater, counted all the stitches in order to recreate the pattern, and then they had a mill recreate the yarn. Unfortunately, if you missed the webinar, there is no recording that you can watch now, at least not the one that I could find, but you can see photos of the sweater and you can even get a copy of the pattern if that's something you're interested in. Again, I will leave links to everything that I can down in the show notes. And if any of you know about this particular webinar and if it is available somewhere online after the fact, that'd be great if you could share it down in the comments. This tidbit came up in my Twitter feed. Once again, the University of Glasgow is going to be offering a free online seminar series. And this year it is for 17th and 18th century material culture. And this is the way that it is described. Each week we'll hear from two speakers sharing their research on and approaches to the study of 17th and 18th century material and visual culture. From reassessing how the work of female artists is read to European visualization of Latin America and the exchange of objects, this year's program covers a broad range of topics. We aim to make a space in which these rich histories can be explored from various disciplines to enhance our research practices. We'll be meeting on Wednesdays from 5 to 6 GMT, that's Greenwich Mean Time, online using Zoom. And you can sign up to receive the joining link and reminders I'll leave a link down below in the show notes. Registration closes 40 minutes before the seminar start time. So there's going to be 6 seminars, and the first one is on September 28th, and the last one will be on December 7th. You can register via Eventbrite, and again, it's free, and I will leave links down in the show notes. It shouldn't be a secret that I have a deep interest in the evolution of hand knitting during the 20th century. I have been working on my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade from the 1890s to the 1990s for almost 4 years now. And for the past couple of years, I've been a member of the Knitting and Crochet Guild of the UK, which means I can request digital copies of patterns from their huge archive for personal use. And I did get my copy of the 1940s sweater I knit for this project from their archives. Well, in the past couple of years during the pandemic, there have been a lot of Zoom conferences and presentations on fashion history and material culture hosted by various UK academic institutions, like the one I just mentioned in the previous tidbit. One of the presentations I saw in the past year or so was from Dr. Ellie Reed, who studies women's magazines from the first half of the 20th century. One of her other passions is knitting, so she couldn't help but notice and be interested in the knitting patterns that were published in those women's magazines. The presentation that I saw that she gave was about those knitting patterns and the different types of magazines that published those patterns. So this week, a Raveler named Chizzy started a discussion thread in my Ravelry group about a project that Dr. Reed is working on right now that I find absolutely fascinating. So there's a little description that says, Brunel University researcher Dr. Ellie Reed has uploaded images from over 5,000 pattern leaflets in the Knitting and Crochet Guild's collection. By recording data from these images, you will provide her with information about more leaflets than she could survey on her own. So what she's done is create a project on a website called Zooniverse, and that website facilitates volunteer-based research. I had never heard of Zooniverse before, and Dr. Reed's project is labeled as under review at the moment. I'm not sure exactly what that means. I don't know if she's reviewing whether or not to take it to official status by kind of gauging the results that she gets from her volunteer researchers, or if the project is under review by Zooniverse, whoever runs that website. I just don't know what that means. But I spent some time earlier this week going through the process and going through some of these pattern photos to help out with this project to see what it was. And you can do that as well. So I'm going to leave a link to the actual project page. When I looked at it earlier today, there was a little note that said, there's no data for this project, click this to ignore. And I clicked it, and then everything looked the way it looked the other day. And you can go, so if you get a message like that, just say dismiss that and go forward. So there's an about page where you can read about the project. There's a field guide that helps you understand what the tasks are that are associated with assessing these different images. So what she's doing is for just the cover photo of the leaflet has been uploaded. And if you are given that cover photo, then you answer a series of questions that you select. So is it a knitting pattern or a crochet pattern? Who is the intended user of this thing? Is it like for a baby? Is it for a child, an adult, a man, woman? Is it a garment? Is it an accessory? Is it a houseware item? All of those kinds of questions. And then you'll be asked things like, are there trimmings or embellishments? What kind of fastenings are there? There are also questions about what sort of fabric it is, like lace or cables and that kind of thing. So for each pattern photo, they're collecting data from 5 different volunteers just to make sure that there's agreement from the volunteers on each of these different questions. So if this is something that is of interest to you, you can check the show notes. I got a comment on one of my videos from a viewer named Kristen, and she said, recently I started wondering to what extent my experience of knitting a pattern impacts my interest in wearing it, even if I'm very pleased with the outcome. She said she's not talking about projects knitted in grief, but about patterns that can potentially be very challenging or even unpleasant to create. I'm curious to know if you are put off of a finished object, if your knitting experience is a slog, even if you've learned numerous things. This is an interesting question, and I think you're going to get a different answer from every knitter. You certainly wouldn't get the same answer from me 10 years, 15, 20 years ago. I have evolved as a knitter, and in many ways, I know now what is likely to bug me or be a problem. Now, I always make boneheaded mistakes. There's almost never a project in which I haven't made a boneheaded mistake. and that can frustrate me, and I end up having to learn lessons that I really didn't set out to learn. That can certainly happen. The negative feelings that I might have about a project tend to occur while I'm knitting the project, and oftentimes it will be enough to cause me to just stop the project. And the thing that's most likely to cause me to give up on a project is if it is very tedious. Not just that it's boring or monotonous, but that it is tedious. Like, I have to pay attention. It might be very repetitive, and the pattern might be actually very easy to follow, but it also might be very easy to make a mistake and very difficult to fix that mistake. So the things that I don't tolerate is having difficulty fixing mistakes. If I can't ladder down or do something to really minimize the number of stitches that I need to fix, and I can see that I'm not going to stop making mistakes because I've never stopped making mistakes, I'm going to give up the project. I'm not going to do it. The projects that tend to be the biggest slog tends to be gifts. Like, somebody asks me to knit something for them. And I've learned, and usually it's something like a giant blanket. And I've just learned over the years what it is that really bugs me about knitting blankets. Like, what is the part where it gets really difficult and where I lose my motivation, and what I can do to circumvent that. So, like, knitting a blanket all in one piece, a huge blanket, I'm not going to do that again, because it just gets to be too big and unwieldy and heavy. So the last time I knit a big blanket, it was for my niece as a wedding gift. We planned it a year ahead because I knew it would take me a year, that I'd need to take breaks from it. I knew that I tend to lose my enthusiasm about a third of the way into the blanket when I've been working on it a few weeks and it starts getting kind of big. And so my plan was to knit it in 3 separate pieces and then join those pieces together at the end. And I just put it on my calendar, work on part 2 out of 3, work part 3 out of 3, 3 months apart from each other throughout the year. So, but that's something that I had to learn over time. And it was a big slog. I was happy with the result, and then it sent it off. It's not in my house. I don't ever have to deal with any feelings about it. There have been some projects for the long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade that got to be a bit of a slog, as particularly the 1960s sweater. And I knew that it was going to be a challenge for me from the beginning because it was mostly stockinette and it was fingering weight. And I just knew that that was going to get boring. I didn't anticipate having to knit both sleeves 2 times. And then, although they fit better the second time, I don't love the fit now. And so there's probably a little bit of, I don't love this sweater so much. But it's also a sweater that I was never destined to wear very often because it is fingering weight and I live in Minnesota. And there's a very small window of time when I can wear a fingering weight sweater in the spring and in the fall. So I'm not that disappointed in it. So that's a really interesting question. I'd be curious to hear if any of you have negative feelings about a sweater, just like resenting the fact that this was so hard or whatever, even if you like it. It's just not something I have experienced myself, but every knitter is different, and why the reasons they knit are different, what they're expecting from the results is different. So let me know down in the comments if you have had negative feelings about a project, even if it turned out well, if it just put you off of using it or wearing it or whatever. My current work in progress is the Kangaroo pouch sweater. It is my 1970s installment of my long-term project to understand the evolution of a hand-knit sweater, hand-knit sweater pattern by knitting a sweater from each decade from the 1890s to the 1990s. This sweater was designed by Elizabeth Zimmermann but was published in her book Knitting Without Tears back in 1971. And like all of Elizabeth Zimmermann's sweater patterns, the instructions are more of a description or guidelines of how to go about knitting a sweater that will fit you. So a sweater of a particular style, starting with a key measurement. In this case, that would be the finished chest size, and then using percentages to calculate other circumferences like the upper arm or the wrist. The percentages aren't always the same from one sweater style to another, and then over time, there was a bit of adjusting to her formulas as fashions changed and the amount of ease that people wanted evolved as well. So the Kangaroo pouch sweater is a seamless set-in sleeve sweater. The body is worked bottom up entirely in the round up to the underarms. And then the underarm stitches are placed on waist yarn, and then the sweater is continued in the round up to the shoulders. So steeks are cut in order to open up the armholes, and then stitches are picked up around the now open armhole, and the sleeve is then worked from the top down using a method of shaping that sleeve cap that is very similar to the heel turn of a heel flap and gusset sock construction. And that was what really got me and was something I'd never seen before. So Zimmermann's goal with this sweater was to solve the challenge of knitting a sweater with set-in sleeves without having to do any seaming. A set-in sleeve tends to have this sleeve cap up here. In most cases, at that time, it had to be knit flat and then seamed into the armhole. So she wanted to solve that problem of a set-in sleeve sweater without having to do any seaming, but she was also trying to avoid knitting flat because she disliked purling. So she didn't want to have to knit flat from the underarm, the body flat from the underarm up to the neck. She wanted to continue working in the round. So she frequently knit sweaters using as much stockinette in the round as possible in order to avoid purling. So she had yoke style sweaters and drop shoulder sweaters, all of those that were done completely in the round. But it was more of a challenge with the set-in sleeve. So I don't actually enjoy knitting endless stockinette, and I don't mind purling. So my sweater incorporates several stitch patterns from Barbara Walker's Second Treasury of Knitting Patterns, which was published in 1970. So another 1970s book. So you can see the stitch patterns right here. I could have avoided the Steeks and knit the front and back separately, but one of my goals for this long-term project is to try construction methods I haven't seen or done before to see what I think of that process. So I wanted to knit a sweater with Steeks, and I wanted to try her unique sleeve cap construction. So let's go to the overhead, and I'll give you some more up-close look at my version of the Kangaroo pouch sweater. So I want to talk a little bit about how I handle making mistakes, how I keep track of where I am in the pattern, and those kinds of things. So this orange marker that I have in the fabric marks the beginning of the round. I have another one, so this moss stitch is divided. There's some on the front and some on the back. And then on this side, I have one, it's a different color that tells me I'm at the mid round. So this is really helpful to me, just keeps me oriented when I'm working in the round because the front and the back are worked identically. And then the other thing I have to keep track of is how the pattern changes, because these diagonal or these zigzags are mirrored, and then the diamonds, they get wider and then they get narrower. And so I have to keep track of when am I supposed to be knitting or purling and when am I moving this way versus when I'm moving that way. So every so often I just lay it down and make sure that everything looks right. And the zigzags are something where it's not uncommon for me to get part way in this, like halfway. And so I have the same number of knits on either side and then end up going in the wrong direction. Particularly since these are mirrored, if I did something on this side, I might just automatically want to do the same thing over here. So I check every few rounds and just make sure that these diagonals are going the right way, and also that I'm working the right number of knit stitches along here. There's 3 knits here, and then you have, you know, if there's more stitches over to the right or left, those are all going to be reverse stockinette. And then there gets to be a point where they're all knits all the way across, and then you continue knitting across here. So those are places where I just have to keep track and make sure that I'm doing things correctly. And what happened at one point is I was about here, and there was something about, I was doing some purl stitches, and I thought, hold on a second, I don't remember doing that many purl stitches in the previous diamond. This is the first one of the round. And I went and I checked, and sure enough, I had done 4 knit stitches. And so I marked this one, just marked that stitch, so that when I came back around to it, I would fix it. If I am working flat, if I'm working back and forth, oftentimes if I'm on a right side row and I recognize that I've made a mistake, I will actually tink back. I will unknit to that location, fix it, and then move on, just because it's easier for me to see from the right side of the work. I could do this, mark that stitch, and make sure that when I got to it on the wrong side, I fixed it. But I'd be doing probably a lot of, like, I'd have to flip it back and forth to make sure that I knew what it was I had to do. And so it just depends on the situation. For this particular project, because I'm working in the round, the right side always faces, there was no point in me going back and undoing all of these stitches that were perfectly fine. I just marked the one that was bad, and now I'm about to get to that point and I can fix it. So here's the problem. This pattern repeats for 2 rounds, and so I've established the first round of what's supposed to go on here, and so I have a knit here, knit here, and knit here. I should have purled that stitch. So I'm getting close to that point. I have purl and a purl, and I need to switch this knit to a purl. The way that I do it, I do have videos on fixing these kinds of mistakes that are a little bit more careful, or that use crochet hooks or whatever. But here's the way that I actually do it. I pop it off the needle. I let that one out, and I get it back on the needle and get that thread in front, because when you purl, you're always coming in from behind and the yarn is in front. So I want this yarn in front, and so I just bring my needle through as if to purl. I bring my needle under that stitch in so that I can pull it through. Now it's on the right hand needle, and so now I can move it back over to that needle, and I can continue on in pattern. And so for this round, anything that's a knit, I'm going to knit it. Anything that's a purl, I'm going to purl it. I want to show you one other thing that I'm doing. So as I mentioned, this is the beginning of the round, and this one is the middle of the round. So the front and the back are identical, and so if this is the beginning of the round and I'm starting in my moss stitch pattern right here, and then I knit all the way across and I get to doing the moss stitch. For the middle of the round, there's complete stitch pattern continuity from the front to the back, because this is the middle of the round. But if I got to the end of the round, the problem that I would have with this stitch pattern is that there would be a jog, because when you're knitting in the round, you're actually knitting a spiral. So if you start the round, if this indicates the beginning around this finger, and this is the end of the round, when I get to the end of the round, that last stitch appears to be a row higher than the beginning of the round, because again, you're working in a spiral. So if this is round 1, then the beginning of round 2 is actually next to the end of round 1. So if the stitch pattern changes at the end of round and beginning of round transition, then you can get a jog in the pattern. If the last stitch of the round or the first stitch of the round is always a knit or always a purl, so that you have a column of stitches that are always identical, then you don't have that issue with a jog, or the jog is separated by that column a little bit. It's just not as obvious. So it would be obvious in this stitch pattern. So when I began the sweater and I needed to establish the stitch pattern, I started with the round 1 pattern and I worked it all the way around until I got it to here. And then instead of working the round 1 pattern, I started the round 2 pattern right away. So anytime that I get to this point here, I'm starting the next round in terms of the moss stitch. What that means is there is a single jog at the bottom where the initial spiral began. So I have 2 rows of the initial stitch pattern here, and I only have 1 row here, but already there's a jog there, and it's pretty minimal. It's at the bottom. It's adjacent to this row of purl stitches that create the turning row. There's just no way to see that. That is so minor compared to what that jog would look like up the side. So that's how I'm handling avoiding the jog. So the style of a sweater is defined by what is going on between the underarm and the neck. This is what I've been talking about in my Technique Tuesday videos in the past couple of months. So a modified drop shoulder sweater is one, if you are working bottom up, you can do the shaping top down or bottom up, but if you were working bottom up, you'd get to where the underarm is, and then you'd bind off about an inch or so on each side. If you're making a much larger sweater, you might even do like 1.5 inches to 1 3/4 on each side. The idea is to just reduce the width a bit of the part between the underarm and the shoulder so that they don't hang over quite as much. A set-in sleeve takes that a step further, and typically you'd have that same 1 inch or so bind off, but then as you worked your way up the armhole, you would be decreasing until you got down to where the width of the front or the back was the actual width of your shoulder, so that you aren't going to have anything hanging over the edge. And then the sleeve that you insert is going to have some shaping that will curve around the top of the shoulder and will fill in this space right here. This kangaroo pouch sweater is kind of a hybrid of a modified drop and a set-in sleeve shoulder, in that she has you put all of the stitches needed to reduce the width of the sweater, has you put all of those stitches on waste yarn before you work the armhole straight up. Rather than working the front separately from the back as you would typically do in a situation like this, she then has you cast on some bridge stitches that reconnect the front to the back so that you continue working this upper part in the round. So she is basically calling for casting on 2 stitches here, and then later on each of those stitches will be machine sewn with 2 columns of stitches and then separated between you cut up between the 2 stitches. I wanted a little bit larger bridge. I wanted to anchor each of these full stitches down and then cut up the center of the middle stitch instead. I just wanted a little bit more of a bridge. It's pretty common to have at least 3, if not 5 or even 7 bridge stitches in a steek. In stranded color work, you're creating this bridge of stitches by alternating between the 2 colors that you are working. And so you'll have these vertical stripes of the different colors. And since you need to anchor down more than 1 color at that steek, it makes sense to have 5 to 7 stitches. I felt like 3 was enough. So I cast on 3 stitches at this edge and 3 at this edge, and then I continued working in the round. I worked until I got another diamond finished, and then I put the center 25 stitches, which is about 5 inches. I put those on waste yarn, and then again, I created another bridge of 3 stitches. So this is going to be the neck opening. It's going to be a pretty simple square neck opening, just like this is a pretty simple shape for the armhole. I debated about maybe only putting half of this these stitches on waste yarn and then working some decreases in order to create more of a curved shape. But I decided just to go with that neckline. She, for whatever reason, tended to do square necklines a lot, and I don't know if that was just because it was a simple shape. I'm not really sure what her reasoning was, but it was something that was very common for her, so I decided to do that. Once you get up to the top, up to the shoulders, she instructs just to bind off all of the stitches on the front and then to work the back with some shoulder shaping. And then she has a specific way of doing the bind off for the shoulder shaping to create more of an angled edge. And I did swatch that to see what it was. It's this bias bind off. And it's something that I had done back in the 80s. I'd had some sweaters that called for that. I prefer to do short row shaping and a 3-needle bind off. So as is true for a lot of these vintage projects, if they have a very specific technique that they're calling for, I try it, see what I think, and in a swatch. And if I think, I don't think I want to use that, then I use the technique that I normally use. So what I did, instead of binding off all of the front stitches, I bound off the Steek stitches, all 3 Steek stitches, worked across until I got to the bridge stitches here, bound those off, worked across to here, and bound off these bridge stitches. And then I worked the shoulder shaping. Because the front was ending at a diamond and I didn't want to have a partial stitch patterns at the back, I decided to work the shoulder shaping in just regular moss stitch. When it came to actually securing the stitches in those bridge stitches in preparation for cutting the Steeks, I just decided that I really enjoyed the process of crochet slip stitch for that purpose. I was a little concerned though, because my project yarn is such a smooth yarn, and I was really worried. I was rethinking the fact that I had only done 3 bridge stitches. I should have done 5, you know, what am I going to do? And should I do the machine stitching, even though I prefer crochet, and I didn't know what to do. So I was asking in my Ravelry group for people who were experienced at steeking, and so many people recommended a method that I had not learned in the class I took years ago on steeking. We had learned 3 different methods back then. We had hand, back stitch, crochet, and machine stitching. So those were the 3 methods that I was aware of. People kept talking about needle felting. And I thought, needle felting, what are they talking about? And so I Googled it, and it turned out that a woman who I actually know, we were on our guild's retreat committee together a couple of years ago. Her name's Gretchen Funk. She had written an article for Modern Daily Knitting a couple of years ago, and she'd also taught this technique at Meg Swanson's knitting camp a few years ago. So Meg Swanson, of course, is Elizabeth Zimmermann's daughter, and she took over the knitting camps when Elizabeth no longer was doing them. And Meg had a video on the technique. And what I noticed was that the tools that Gretchen and Meg were using were very different from the needle felting kit that I bought probably back in 2005 or 6. And I looked at what they did, and I ordered that equipment, but I was pretty certain, first of all, that I didn't want to wait until everything came before I cut my Steeks and continued working on the sweater. But I didn't think my bridge was wide enough to use that tool. So I want to go back to the overhead, and I'll show you what I ended up doing to use that idea of needle felting, but also realizing that I only had a very small bridge to work with. So these are the tools that people are talking about using for needle felting a bridge of stitches. So the idea is that you lay the fabric down so that the bridge is face up, the right side of the fabric is facing you, And then you have this little tool and you go along the bridge stitches, and these, I don't know if you can see these needles come out and they punch the fabric. And the fabric stays smooth on the right side, but on the back side it gets all fuzzy and felted. So my bridge was only 3 stitches wide, and this tool would have been too wide for that. And also I didn't want to wait for the tool to come. So instead I did a trick that my friend Joan Schrouder mentioned in my Ravelry group, which was before you cut them on the back side, take a wet toothbrush with some soap in it and kind of go along those bridge stitches to try to felt them a little bit. The agitation with the soap, that could help lock those stitches in. So I did do that, and then the next morning everything was dry and I cut them, and then I panicked that it still wasn't stable enough. So I just put it to the side for a few days and didn't quite know what to do. And so then the tools showed up and I thought, well, maybe I can felt along the edge with this tool. That wasn't going to work, but I did have my old needle felting kit from like 2005 that has this old foam thing right here. These tools are just a single needle that you can take out. And so I combined the new tools with the old tools. I put the brush in here so that this fabric was lying on top. And then I just took this tool and I went along the actual pink line of the crocheted stitches all the way up and down like that. And what that did was on the back side, it actually felted the stitches a little bit. So then I felt like they were more secure, and I felt much better about picking up and handling the fabric, because I was really worried that even just being really careful with whatever was currently in my hand, that the other things that were cut open would somehow fall apart just rubbing against things. So everything's cut open. This armhole is cut open. You can see how much it looks like it's just a right angle right here. I have picked up the stitches around this one and done the sleeve cap shaping for this, and now I'm working my way down the sleeve with decreases underneath. And then this is the neck opening. It's a square neck opening, and I'll be just doing something very basic around there. I'll go more into how this sleeve works and how this compares to Barbara Walker's method of doing a seamless top-down satin sleeve. I'll talk about that more next week. My original plan for this 1970s sweater was to use Elizabeth Zimmermann's approach to designing sweaters using her percentage system, and then use Barbara Walker's stitch patterns and apply those to the sweater. And the reason for that was that I was already familiar with Barbara Walker's techniques for knitting top-down sweaters, and specifically even seamless sweaters with set-in sleeves. She has 2 different approaches that are different, with some similarities to Elizabeth Zimmermann's, and I was familiar with them, so that wouldn't have been new to me. So I really wanted to go with the Elizabeth Zimmermann approach. And what I have found as I've been knitting this sweater is that I am referring to Barbara Walker's book as well, just to compare how she does specific things compared to how Elizabeth Zimmermann is doing. So again, these are both 1970s sources. They were published very close together. So a knitter in the early 70s would have had access to both of these books. And so some of the modifications that I am planning, say for the sleeves, are based on some of what I'm seeing in Barbara Walker's book. So I really am combining the 2 women into this one sweater in ways that I didn't quite expect from the beginning. And I'll be talking more about that next week. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.